They called it cheap, inferior, and irrelevant. But today, that same fighter jet, the JF-17 Thunder, is forcing the West to ask one terrifying question. What happens when a nation they tried to control no longer needs them? The JF-17 Thunder was once seen by Western defense analysts as a budget fighter aircraft with limited capabilities and almost no strategic relevance. In its early years, it was mocked in international military circles as a symbolic gesture of cooperation between Pakistan and China, nothing more than a cheaper, watered-down alternative to Western fighters. But as the years have progressed, the JF-17 has defied these dismissals and transformed into something far more formidable and unsettling to Western interests. It is no longer just a fighter jet cobbled together to fill gaps in the Pakistan Air Force. It has evolved into a credible platform that represents something much more powerful: strategic independence. The JF-17 doesn't merely fly with Chinese radar or Pakistani engineering. It flies with a message. And that message is, Pakistan is no longer willing to depend on Western powers for the preservation of its national sovereignty. This is what makes the aircraft so threatening to the West. It isn't the shape of the fuselage or the thrust-to-weight ratio that triggers concern in Washington or London. It's the idea that a once-dependent state is choosing to fly solo, both literally and geopolitically. The JF-17 marks a shift in how smaller nations approach defense. It proves that a modern combat aircraft no longer needs to come with strings attached. The West has long built its power on selling weapon systems that require continuous maintenance, software updates, and political permissions for upgrades or deployment. With the JF-17, Pakistan has shown that these rules can be bypassed. It has co-developed a platform that it can modify, export, and utilize on its own terms. And more importantly, it's doing this while expanding its influence across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. The symbolism here is not lost on the West. What once was considered an inferior aircraft has now become an icon of military self-sufficiency. It doesn't just challenge airspace, it challenges narratives. The narrative that a Muslim-majority nation, once dependent on IMF loans and US military packages, can now chart its own course and supply other countries with advanced tools of deterrence. In essence, the JF-17 has become Pakistan's declaration of autonomy, an airborne rebuke to decades of dictated defense policies and selective alliances. The real fear, therefore, is not what the JF-17 can do in a dogfight, but what it represents in the arena of global military realignment. The emergence of the JF-17 Thunder as a widely exportable fighter jet has disrupted the traditional arms market, particularly the Western monopoly on high-performance combat aircraft. For decades, nations seeking modern air power were almost always funneled toward US or European options: F-16s, Eurofighters, Rafales, all of which came with steep price tags, strict usage restrictions, and diplomatic entanglements. Countries with limited budgets or strained political relations with the West often found themselves locked out of the modern aerial warfare domain entirely. That equation changed when Pakistan and China introduced the JF-17 as a reliable, low-cost, multi-role fighter that didn't require Western approval for sales, upgrades, or deployment. The West fears this development not because the JF-17 outperforms an F-35 or an F-15, but because it opens the gates for independent militarization by countries that were previously kept in check by economic constraints or political pressure. When nations like Nigeria, Myanmar, and potentially Argentina show interest or finalize deals for the JF-17, they're not just buying an aircraft, they're buying sovereignty from Western oversight. The threat is not just tactical, it's ideological. The JF-17 has made it possible for smaller, non-aligned nations to assert regional influence without asking for Western permission or assistance. And unlike Western platforms, which often come with end-user agreements and embedded restrictions, the JF-17 offers operational autonomy. Nations can customize, maintain, and deploy it on their own terms, often with Chinese technical backing. This creates a new geopolitical dynamic where the West is no longer the gatekeeper of advanced air power. It also threatens the economic interests of Western defense contractors who have enjoyed decades of lucrative arms sales under the guise of alliance building and regional stability. The fact that the JF-17 is now a contender in international tenders, previously dominated by Lockheed Martin or Dassault, signals the rise of an alternate global military supply chain that the West cannot fully monitor or control. This shift doesn't just alter market dynamics, it weakens the leverage that Western countries have traditionally wielded through defense deals. The ability to grant or withhold fighter jets has been used as a political weapon for decades, but Pakistan's growing defense export capability, embodied by the JF-17, undermines that leverage. As more nations adopt the JF-17, the West sees its global influence diluted, not through war or conflict, but through the quiet, strategic empowerment of states once considered peripheral. That silent erosion of control, powered by a jet once mocked as a cheap copy, is exactly what fuels the growing unease across Western capitals. The integration of the JF-17 Thunder with Chinese military technology has become one of the most alarming signals for the West because it represents more than just collaboration between two nations. It symbolizes the operational fusion of two strategic ecosystems outside the Western sphere of control. The aircraft is not just co-produced, it is co-evolved, built around Chinese avionics, radars, missiles, and battlefield data systems. With upgrades like the KLJ-7A Active Electronically Scanned Array (AESA) radar, advanced beyond visual range air-to-air missiles (BVRAMs) like the PL-15, and improved electronic warfare suites, the JF-17 has taken a significant leap forward. It now rivals older Western fourth-generation fighters, not just in function, but in affordability, ease of deployment, and availability. This growing synergy between Pakistan and China through the JF-17 program is no longer just a tactical convenience. It is a long-term strategic architecture that has the potential to spread to multiple regions simultaneously, creating a rival bloc to NATO-aligned weapon systems. This deeply worries the West because it erodes one of its foundational power structures, technological dominance. For decades, Western superiority in avionics, radar systems, and missile technology has formed the core of its military and diplomatic leverage. Countries bought Western weapons not just for their performance, but because they came with a guarantee of being on the right side of the global military-industrial hierarchy. The JF-17, however, offers something different. Good enough performance at a fraction of the cost, free from the surveillance and control mechanisms that come with Western arms deals. When Chinese missiles are launched from Pakistani jets, guided by Chinese radar and maintained through Chinese software, there is no room for Western override, shutdown, or intelligence interception. That autonomy is what threatens Western command models more than anything. Furthermore, this level of Sino-Pakistani military cooperation showcases to the world that high-level combat readiness is no longer an exclusive club. It can be shared, scaled, and localized. It signals to nations under arms embargoes, or those tired of waiting for congressional approvals or end-user monitoring protocols, that there is another path, one that does not require obedience to a global order set by Washington or Brussels. This is what gives the JF-17 its disruptive power. It's not just about the aircraft's capabilities, it's about the ecosystem behind it, an ecosystem that can replicate itself in countries eager to break free from Western influence. The West sees this and recognizes that the JF-17 is no longer just a fighter jet. It is a technological ambassador of a parallel defense order, an order that no longer needs the West to define what military modernity looks like. For decades, global air superiority was dictated by a simple rule. Only the wealthiest and most powerful nations had access to modern fighter jets capable of competing in contemporary aerial warfare. This reality ensured that air dominance remained the privilege of NATO members or key Western allies. The JF-17 Thunder has broken that rule. It has given smaller nations the ability to rewrite the narrative by offering a combat aircraft that delivers essential modern capabilities at a fraction of the cost. The Thunder is not about competing directly with fifth-generation stealth platforms like the F-35. It doesn't need to. Its role is far more revolutionary. It empowers states with limited budgets to field a credible air force capable of air-to-air combat, precision ground attacks, and electronic warfare operations, thereby challenging the traditional global military hierarchy. The Western defense architecture has relied on economic barriers to maintain control. Fighter jets like the Eurofighter Typhoon, the Rafale, or the F-16 come with such high price tags, complex logistics, and political strings that only a few nations can afford and operate them independently. The JF-17 disrupts this. It's relatively simple to maintain, customizable, and politically untethered. When paired with advanced sensors, long-range weapons, and real-time battlefield awareness through Chinese technology, it becomes a dangerous tool in the hands of nations previously thought to be irrelevant in air power conversations. The ability to deploy a squadron of jets that can intercept intrusions, strike strategic targets, and defend national sovereignty without dependency on Western maintenance chains creates a psychological shift. It tells the world that air power is no longer gated behind elite memberships. It is accessible, and that access is spreading. What the West truly fears is the proliferation of this model. When one country proves it can sustain independent air power without US approval or European contractors, others begin to follow. Nigeria already operates the JF-17. Myanmar has ordered them. Argentina and Iraq have shown interest. If more countries take this path, then Western arms manufacturers lose clients, and more importantly, the West loses strategic control. Military assistance, sales, and dependency have always been tools of influence. Deciding which nations get upgraded radars or extended-range missiles has never been about capability alone. It's about leverage. The JF-17, in essence, is breaking that monopoly. It levels the playing field just enough to create resistance to global power structures. When a jet built by a Chinese-Pakistani alliance gives nations the ability to defend airspace and launch precision attacks without Western oversight, the entire architecture of deterrence and influence begins to tilt. That tilt, more than any single dogfight or sortie, is what alarms the West, because it represents a future where more nations say no to dependency and yes to strategic self-determination. Pakistan's air doctrine has undergone a visible transformation, and the JF-17 Thunder sits at the core of this evolution. For much of its post-independence history, Pakistan's Air Force strategy centered around defensive capabilities, responding to incursions, protecting airspace, and maintaining deterrence through minimal credible retaliation. However, recent events and technological advancements have reshaped that approach into a far more proactive, assertive, and strategic doctrine, one that prioritizes readiness, rapid response, and the projection of power. The JF-17, with its increasing capabilities and autonomous supply chain, has become the symbol of this shift. No longer bound by the logistical leash of Western military hardware, Pakistan can now plan, deploy, and engage on its own terms. The country doesn't need to wait for political clearance to strike, nor fear the withholding of spare parts or software updates during moments of tension. That self-sufficiency is vital for a nation surrounded by complex threats and regional rivalries. The world saw this doctrine in action during Operation Swift Retort in 2019, when the Pakistan Air Force deployed JF-17s in a bold retaliatory strike following an Indian air raid in Balakot. The aircraft weren't just in the air, they were active participants in precision targeting and deterrent signaling. The JF-17s demonstrated that Pakistan could respond decisively and on time. They didn't need American F-16s or French Mirages to carry the weight of national defense. Instead, a fighter platform co-developed with China, owned outright, and maintained domestically, proved itself in a live, high-stakes engagement. That shift from passive defense to active deterrence was not a tactical adjustment. It was a doctrinal transformation. It signaled that Pakistan was no longer playing the role of a reactive state, but was positioning itself as a preemptive force with the tools to protect its sovereignty proactively. The West watches this with concern, because strategic autonomy in the hands of a nuclear-armed country changes the calculus of diplomacy and military pressure. The JF-17 gives Pakistan the ability to escalate or de-escalate without outside influence. It can patrol borders, shadow intrusions, or launch targeted strikes with precision-guided munitions, all without the risk of being grounded by sanctions or foreign export controls. This means that Western powers lose leverage during crises. They can no longer pressure Islamabad through the threat of withholding military supplies or blocking upgrades. The JF-17, backed by Chinese support and Pakistani resilience, gives Pakistan not just wings in the air, but freedom on the ground, in its decision-making, in its doctrine, and in its defense diplomacy. That's not just a change in aircraft capability. It's a complete restructuring of how Pakistan sees its role in South Asia and how the world must now engage with it. The rise of the JF-17 Thunder is not just the story of a new fighter jet, it is the story of a nation reshaping its global image, rewriting the terms of engagement, and breaking the mold it was once forced to fit into. For decades, Pakistan has been portrayed through narrow lenses: a fragile democracy, a nation tethered to IMF bailouts, a country reliant on US military aid or Chinese political shielding. But the JF-17 has altered that perception dramatically. It represents something the West finds deeply unsettling: a sovereign, self-equipped, and increasingly assertive military power emerging in South Asia that is no longer willing to play by rules written elsewhere. The jet's evolution from an experimental platform to a combat-tested, exportable weapon system has been accompanied by a transformation in Pakistan's strategic identity. It is no longer just defending its skies, it is shaping the skies it wants to command, and it's doing so without asking permission. The West fears this transformation, not because Pakistan is becoming aggressive, but because it's becoming independent. Independence in military affairs means freedom of movement in political affairs. A country that does not rely on US-made jets is a country that doesn't need to fear US sanctions. A country that doesn't need French avionics doesn't need to bow to European conditionalities. The JF-17 program, with its Chinese partnership, indigenous production lines, and growing export potential, is Pakistan's signal to the world that it is done with the narrative of dependency. It can create, sell, deploy, and improve its own tools of defense, and that gives it a voice in international affairs that can't be muted through economic coercion or diplomatic isolation. This rising capability gives Pakistan new leverage in a region already saturated with strategic tension. It is now better positioned to negotiate from strength, to deter without begging for support, and to influence the defense outlooks of countries that once viewed it as a recipient, not a supplier. The growing interest from nations like Nigeria, Azerbaijan, and potentially Argentina proves that the world is paying attention. If Pakistan can build and export a combat jet that performs reliably in actual engagements, it reshapes the conventional defense ecosystem that has long favored the West. It presents a new model, a Muslim-majority country creating cutting-edge military technology, offering it to others, and doing so outside the purview of NATO or Western hegemony. This model inspires, and that inspiration worries the West, because if Pakistan can do it, others can follow, and if enough do, the Western-led order of arms, influence, and compliance begins to crack at its foundations. The JF-17 is not just an aircraft, it's a warning shot across the bow of global power imbalance, flown by a nation that refuses to stay in its assigned place. The JF-17 Thunder is more than a fighter jet. It is Pakistan's declaration of independence from a global system designed to keep nations compliant, dependent, and silent. It symbolizes a new era where military power is no longer dictated by Western dollars or dictated defense alliances. Through this aircraft, Pakistan has not only rewritten the rules of regional deterrence, but has challenged the very architecture of global influence. The West doesn't fear the JF-17 because of its price or payload. It fears what it represents: a sovereign, self-determined, and strategically assertive Pakistan that no longer flies under anyone's shadow.